So we've been talking about the path of the Bodhisattva, and we went through and looked at it in terms of ethics, which is actually fairly simplistic. It builds upon the path of individual liberation in terms of some of the specifics, but it really is focusing on just expanding that then toward all sentient beings. And then we looked at practices, there's several of those. We looked at it first in the context of the 6 paramitas, or 6 perfections. And we did the practice on generosity, which is the first one, which is actually a form of being a bodhisattva. You're being generous with others. And we looked at the other parts of that, and then we started looking at the 4 immeasurables, and we went through some different practices associated with those: loving kindness, compassion, joy, equanimity, and so forth. And so now we're moving on to the 3rd training on the path of the Bodhisattva, which is wisdom. And so the path of the Bodhisattva is firmly grounded in the teaching of the Buddhas, the sutras that are the record of the teachings of the Buddha. And yet there, over time, was some evolution in the process of understanding the idea of wisdom from a Buddhist point of view. And so it was changed a little bit. It was expanded to try and reinforce that in some ways. And so what we're going to do is look at 3 of those ways, or 3 forms of literature related to that. The first one we'll talk a little bit about is called Buddha nature. The second one that we will look at is called Madhyamaka, or the middle way. And the third one, or actually the other order, we'll do the second one is Transcendent Wisdom, or Prajnaparamita, and then the third one will be the middle way, or Madhyamaka. And we'll also do a practice associated with that as well. Now, for the lay practitioner, it's not particularly important that you have a real depth of understanding. These are philosophical positions, and it gets pretty detailed. Some of these books are very, very detailed, and they're really looking at the various schools that were prevalent at that time and making arguments back and forth with those different schools and their positions on different issues and so forth. And so all of that is interesting. It's helpful and worth taking some time to dig into those things, but it's not absolutely necessary in terms of having a basic understanding that's useful to you in terms of your practice. And so we're going to basically summarize each of these in a way that give you the essence of what it is that they are all about. And so we'll start with Buddha nature. This is a book on Buddha nature, the Uttara Tantra. The Uttara Tantra is the treatise on Buddha nature, and then there are commentaries on that, which a commentary is called a Shastra, and so we have the Uttara Tantra Shastra. So that is the commentary on that, and this actually is a commentary on the commentary, so we get multiple levels of that. This particular one comes from Khinchen Tranggu Rinpoche, and who's a good writer, has written quite a few books on Buddhism, and so this is one of them. Well, as you recall, when the Buddha was first teaching what we call the first turning of the wheel, and in that he taught the 4 Noble Truths and the Noble Eightfold Path and some things like that. And then in the second turning of the wheel, he did the teachings on emptiness. And so he talked about the lack of inherent existence and dependent arising, the interdependent nature of all things and so forth as a part of that. Well, then we have what is referred to as the third turning of the wheel. And the third turning of the wheel are the teachings on Buddha nature. And the definition of Buddha nature is luminous emptiness. And the idea is that all sentient beings have Buddha nature. And so if you're a sentient being, you have Buddha nature. And the idea was all came up around a question of how does one actually become a Buddha? What is it that enables a sentient being to become a Buddha? And so the idea was posited that, sorry, that wasn't the idea. The idea was posited that all sentient beings have this Buddha nature inherent in them. And that is what enables them to then, by doing the practice, actually achieve enlightenment, become a Buddha. So that's the basic idea that is behind this. It evolved into two interpretations, two different approaches that you will see as you look at some of the literature on this. The first one talks about it as a seed. And the seed needs to be planted. This is a parallel with karma, for example, where we talk about karmic seeds that are planted in our consciousness and then need to have the right conditions and so forth for that to ripen and that then to manifest in our lives. Well, this is very similar in this philosophy, that it's like a seed that abides in us, and then we do the practice in order to enable ourselves to then ripen that seed and grow, and we then become a Buddha. The second approach is that, in fact, we are already Buddhas. It's just that all of that is obscured. It's like behind a husk or a shell or something like that that needs to be removed before we can really see ourselves as a Buddha. The practices, as it turns out, are the same. In either case, you do the practices. In one case, it's to ripen the seed and grow into a Buddha. In the other case, you do the same practices, but you do them to take away the husk or the shell that's hiding the Buddha nature that you actually already have. So it doesn't really matter in terms of practice which approach that you have, but it is helpful to understand in case you run across that in reading one thing or another about those two. And so through that process, then we remove our afflictive emotions and our mental obscurations, what are sometimes called the two obscurations, and out of that then we are able to extinguish samsara and achieve nirvana or enlightenment. So what exactly do we mean by luminous emptiness, and how is that different from just emptiness itself? Well, what we're talking about is, first of all, the idea, emptiness, as you recall, was the lack of inherent existence. And the idea is that nothing exists except in dependence on other kinds of things. Now, the lack of inherent existence and the dependence on other things are what are the basic cause of emptiness in that case. In the Uttara Tantra, the Buddha, in the form of Buddha Maitreya, who's the Buddha of the future, is the basic definition of Maitreya Buddha, did these teachings, and what he said was that it expanded this view of basic emptiness, and the luminous emptiness, the adjective being added to that, is basically defined as clarity. Not clarity like being transparent, but clarity like, is that clear? Okay? So the idea is that we have a clear understanding of emptiness. One way to think about it is that, as we've talked about previously, when you think of the lack of inherent existence or dependent arising, that's a fairly cognitive process. It's a mental approach to understanding emptiness. So it appears that at some point the Buddha said that is fine, but we really need to go beyond just a mental understanding of this. You need a direct experience of it. And so the basic idea of luminous emptiness is that we have a direct experience of emptiness. And so that is what it is that this is talking about, and then the approaches to this are all focused on that. You might call it even an emptiness of emptiness, because we're getting beyond the idea of emptiness to the direct experience itself. Now, the actual text itself talks about more than just that. It also has, in fact, most of it focuses on chapters on several different things. There's chapters in it on the Buddha. There's chapters in it on Sangha, and there's chapters in it on the Dharma itself. There's a chapter on enlightenment. There's one on the qualities of a Buddha and another on the activities of a Buddha. So it talks about kind of the big picture of what it is to really be a Buddha. The other thing about that is, in understanding what it is to be a Buddha, it begins to take on the nature of what we call Sambhogakaya. There are three kayas, which we'll talk about more when we get into the Path of Nirvana, which will be the next class. But the idea is that it's more than just a physical being. The physical being is the Nirmanakaya. And then this idea came along of a Sambhogakaya, more of a rainbow or transparent-like, more spirit-like, if you will, type of a body of the Buddha. And it's supposed to only be visible to high-level bodhisattvas, or people at the high level of realization. But the idea is included in here when you start looking at some of the qualities of a Buddha, for example. Some of the descriptions are generally accepted as being applied to the Sambhogakaya form, not the physical form of a Buddha. And so when you go through these list after list after list of these different qualities, you don't think about the physical manifestation exhibiting those qualities, but more of a mental or spirit form that actually embodies these qualities. And one of the problems is, if you try to look at them individually, some of them conflict with each other. Okay? So in order for that to happen, it has to be in a different form than an actual physical manifestation here. So that's another idea. In the Path of the Bodhisattva, we begin to change the point of view of the Buddha. If you recall, when we started and we looked at the history of Buddhism, that was one of the things that we talked about, was that there was a change in terms of understanding the nature of a Buddha. Originally, the Buddha was understood as just a human being who had attained this state of enlightenment and was sharing that with other people. Over time, historically, what happened was that the point of view shifted and it became more of a spiritual form of a being. And so that is embodied here in some of the literature, in the Buddha nature literature, and talking about the Buddha and what it means to be a Buddha and so forth. We begin seeing those kinds of qualities and characteristics. The second area is the Prajna Paramita. Prajna Paramita means transcendent wisdom, or the perfection of wisdom. And so the idea is, we take this basic idea, much like we were talking about in the Buddha nature, and we're going a little beyond that to that idea of the direct experience of that. And so there are a number of texts that are labeled Prajna Paramita. And one of those is the Heart Sutra. And this is a book by the Dalai Lama on the essence of the Heart Sutra. So we have the essence of the essence, because the Heart Sutra refers to the essence of Buddhism and the wisdom aspect of Buddhism. And there are also some other texts. There are a number of them whose titles basically go by transcendent wisdom in so many lines. And so there are different numbers of lines in the texts that are being referenced there. And also one that you may have heard of is the Diamond Sutra, is another one that's fairly well known. Now, in the actual text itself, which came about somewhere around 100 BC, the very earliest forms of this we find around, not BC, the Common Era. This is BCE, yeah, 100 BCE, so 100 years before the start of the new millennium. And so that was the very beginning of that, and it was written up in different forms, expanded in different forms, and then eventually it became summarized in the Heart Sutra. And the Heart Sutra basically comes in two forms. There is one that in Sanskrit has 25 lines and one that has 14 lines. And the basic difference between the two, the heart of both of them are the same text, but the 25-line version has some preliminary discussion that kind of introduces it, and it also has some closing text that comes at the end. The middle part is basically the same. Now, there are lots of variations of those two as it's been translated and so forth, but that's the essence of what is included in those. So those are the texts. So what I wanted to do is spend just a little bit of time focusing on the Heart Sutra itself. And I want to read you one translation of this. So that you have first the idea, then I go back and talk a little bit about some of the parts and what it is really trying to say. And so this is the short version, says, Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva of compassion, realizing perfect wisdom, clearly saw that the 5 skandhas are emptiness, thus transcending all suffering. So the 5 skandhas are the 5 aggregates of form, feeling, and so forth that made up the Indian perception of what constituted a being of some kind, and then was also often applied to other phenomena as well. O Shariputra, form is emptiness, emptiness is form. Form is not other than emptiness, emptiness is not other than form. That's probably the most famous line in this text. The same is true with feelings, perceptions, thoughts, and consciousness. O Shariputra, all phenomena are emptiness. They are not produced nor destroyed, not defiled nor pure, not deficient nor complete. Therefore, in emptiness, there is no form, no feelings, no perceptions, no mental formations, and no consciousnesses. There is no eye, no ear, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind. There is no seeing, no hearing, no smelling, no tasting, no touching, no thinking. There is no realm of sight, and so on up to no realm of consciousness. There is no ignorance and no extinction of ignorance. There is no old age and death, and no extinction of old age and death. Likewise, there is no suffering, no origin of suffering, no extinction of suffering, no path. There is no wisdom, no attainment. Since there is nothing to be attained, the Bodhisattvas rely on this perfection of wisdom and abide in it without fear. Liberating themselves from illusion, they awaken ultimate enlightenment. All Buddhas in the past, present, and future attained ultimate enlightenment by relying on this perfect wisdom. Therefore, one should know that perfect wisdom is the greatest mantra, the highest mantra, the incomparable mantra, the mantra that clears all suffering, the deepest truth. The mantra for perfect wisdom is proclaimed, Gate, Gate, Paragate, Parasamgate, Bodhisoha, which means go, go, go beyond, go totally beyond ultimate enlightenment, Soha. The achievement of ultimate enlightenment. So let's look at a few of the things. We began by talking about it in terms of the 5 skandhas. The 5 skandhas, the form, feelings, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. But it starts with the one form. And this goes back to the definition of emptiness. Form is emptiness. So in this case, emptiness is the lack of inherent existence. So when you have form, any physical object, that physical object lacks inherent existence. We've studied that previously, and so that's the basic idea. But the reverse of that is also possibly true. The lack of inherent existence is what enables form to be. And so if you didn't have the lack of inherent existence, since all form consists of the lack of inherent existence, emptiness, then you have to have lack of inherent existence to have form. Okay? And so you have this kind of circular argument about that. And then it goes on to say the same is true of all of the other skandhas. So all of the constituents that make up a being or a piece of phenomena of whatever form also is emptiness. So it's kind of a summary of what we looked at in terms of the wisdom in the path of individual liberation. But then it goes on from that, and it says also that this is not produced or destroyed, defiled or pure or deficient nor complete. That's setting up a new point of view on emptiness. And what it's saying is what in the West we would call via negativia, which means you point out what something is by saying what it is not. And we do that because it is ineffable. It's beyond words. You can't say what it is. You can only say what it is not. So it's not anything that doesn't come into existence. It doesn't disappear. Now, when we were talking about dependent origination, we said the exact opposite of that. We said things come into existence and disappear, therefore they are empty of inherent existence. Okay? So it's a shift in the argument, the very nature of the argument that's being made here. Why? Well, because those in and of themselves are labels that are attached to these ideas. Okay? So the idea that something is produced or destroyed are just labels. That's not ineffable. Those are words. They're labels. Okay? So the rest of this is all about these different things that are just labels, including some that are directly attached to the very idea of Buddhism itself. Okay? So that's what we're going to see as we go through these. So then it goes back through the 5 skandhas. There's no form, feelings, perceptions, mental formations, consciousness. Okay? Just labels. There is no eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, mind. Okay? The sense organs themselves. And then no seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, thinking. The actual processes or perceptions that happen as a result of the sense organs. And then no realm of sight and so on up to the realm of consciousness. So the actual perceptions of those into what we call the sense consciousnesses. Okay, so each sense has a consciousness in a lot of the Buddhist literature. So there's eye consciousness, ear consciousness, and so forth. Labels. Okay? So this is talking about ultimate truth, not relative truth, because in relative truth those still exist. But in ultimate truth, it's beyond that. It's beyond all of the labels that we've been talking about here. There is no ignorance and no extinction of ignorance. Ignorance, as you recall, is the root of all of samsara, all suffering. And here we're saying there's not even that, or its extinction. There is no old age and death, no extinction of old age and death. Suffering itself, the early teachings of the Buddha on suffering talked about birth, sickness, old age, and death. Here he's labeling old age and death as just other labels, all relative. And then it goes on, likewise there's no suffering, no origin of suffering, no extinction of suffering, and no path. The Four Noble Truths. Those two are all relative. There is no wisdom, no attainment. Okay? We eliminated everything. And because there's nothing to attain, we liberate ourselves from illusion. We go beyond the illusion of all of these labels and ideas of things. And that is how we perfect wisdom, by eliminating all of these ideas about it. And we achieve this emptiness of emptiness, if you will. And then the mantra itself, gate gate paragate parasam gate bodhisoha. Go beyond, go totally beyond to ultimate enlightenment. Soha. Yes. And that has also been divided into different aspects. And so the first go refers to accumulating merit. The second go refers to preparing your mind. Then go beyond refers to the direct experience. And then go totally beyond refers to the meditation, which in Tibetan means habituation. So we've prepared our mind, we've had the direct experience, now we habituate that direct experience by repeating this over and over and over again to where it just becomes a natural way of how we see things. and then we attain enlightenment. So that's the basic idea that's embodied here in this particular text, and in fact all of these texts just in more detail and further investigation into the nature of all of those things. So now I want to look at the third one, the middle way, the Madhyamaka approach. And this comes from Nagarjuna. Nagarjuna is the one that lived around 150 to 250 of the Common Era, so in the early millennium, first millennium. And he is considered to be the source of the Middle Way, the founder of the Middle Way school. Some consider him to be the second Buddha. And so he's a very significant individual in the Buddhist tradition. And he states that emptiness and dependent arising, as we've been talking about, have the same importance. In other words, those two are essentially the same thing. If you can establish that something is empty, you can establish it by showing that it is dependently arising from something else, that it has causes and conditions. It's impermanent. If it meets that criterion, then it is empty. And so we can talk about those two terms in exactly the same way. And it reflects the same view of reality. Now, the central tenet that is embodied in all of this, and again, this literature gets extremely complex, but the real core idea of all of this, kind of the essence again, getting back to it, is something called the tetradilemma. And I use this all the time because I think it gets right at the essence of what we're talking about with emptiness. Emptiness is not a thing. So we start thinking about emptiness as a thing. That's not it. And it's very easy to do. The label emptiness itself can be problematic. And as we saw in the Buddha nature literature, the clarity of emptiness, luminous-emptiness, the idea was to go beyond the label, to go beyond that to the direct experience. And so he's saying it's not a thing. Well, the natural tendency then is to say, well, if it's not a thing, then it's no thing or nothing. Total emptiness, a void. Okay? And you'll actually see some of the Buddhist literature actually uses that term, the void there. But it's not no thing. Okay? So that can be a little challenging to get your head around. If it's not a thing and it's not no thing, what is it? Well, the next possibility might be some combination of the two. But he says, no, it's not both. Well, if it's not both, then that means it's really not either one of those. And he says, well, no, it's not neither as well. Okay? Now, logically speaking, you have just eliminated every possible way of thinking about this. And that's the whole point. When you eliminate all of the logical arguments that you can come up with, all of the labels you can come up with, all that's left is, sometimes we call it suchness. Okay? But this is the emptiness that we're talking about. It doesn't not exist, but it doesn't exist either. And again, you can think of it in terms of the Prajnaparamita, the Heart Sutra literature. To say it's a thing or to say it's no thing, those again are just labels. To say it's both or it's neither, again, those are also just labels. So it's very consistent. It's just a unique way that incorporates logical arguments into how to perceive it rather than just saying it's not this, not this, not this, and so forth. Okay? So a little different approach, but in essence it's saying exactly the same thing. So the idea is to get in touch with that experience of that, and then we habituate that over and over and over again until that becomes a comfortable experience, one that we're confident in, and we just tend to see that as the nature of things. Okay? So that's the basic idea as a part of that. Now, it gets a little more complicated, and we're going to go into this in just a little bit more detail, because as we get into the actual practices associated with this, you need just a little bit more understanding of the philosophical schools involved and their way of looking at this. Okay? So I'm going to attempt to do this. This is not a particularly easy thing, but I'm going to just touch on it a little bit. So Madhyamaka is divided into two different groups. The first group is called Rangtong, R-A-N-G-T-O-N-G, Rangtong, and the other one is Shentong, S-H-E-N-T-O-N-G. So Rangtong and Shentong. Now, Rangtong then is further subdivided into two other groups. So we wind up with three. So Rangtong is divided into Sotantrika. I always try to put an extra R in there. Sotantrika, S-V-A.
S what?
V-A. S-V-A. T-A-N-T-R-I-K-A. So the S-V-A, it would be swa in, or sva in Sanskrit, but in Tibetan, you just say so. Sotantrika, and then Prasangika is the second one. P-R-A-S-A-N-G-I-K-A. Prasangika. Okay, so we have Sotantrika and Prasangika. Okay, so we'll get into some names here. I don't think the names are particularly important, but just so you can kind of follow along here how this developed. So we have a person by the name Brahma Viveka, who criticized the method of Nagarjuna and a commentary on that by a person named Buddhapalita. And so Brahmaviveka became the founder of the Sotantrika group. Okay? We can talk about it later. Okay? And then the second one is Chandrakirti. Chandrakirti didn't like that. He went back and defended Buddhapalita, who was defending Nagarjuna or commenting on Nagarjuna. And he became the founder of the Prasangika Madhyamaka. Okay? So basically what we're getting down to is the two founders. We had Nagarjuna, who originated the idea, and we had someone who commented on that, and then we had someone who came along and didn't like that commentary, interpreted it a different way, and founded the Sotantrika school. We had somebody who came along and said, no, you're wrong, you're misunderstanding it. The first commentary was correct, and wrote another commentary, and his name was Chandrakirti. And that became the Prasangika point of view. So two main branches here, and that's the important thing, is the Sotantrika and the Prasangika. Now, a little bit about the approach. Going back then one step up, the Rangtong and Shentong. So Rangtong approach is to establish the emptiness of self-nature of all phenomena. Now we did that before, so in some ways this isn't new, but the way that they did it is a little different. Okay? So Madhyamakas in general do not consider the mind stream of the Chittamatrans to be ultimate emptiness at all. And remember we had the Chittamatran group that we looked at, and we associated them with the path of individual liberation, literally the kind of in between the two. Some say that they're actually part of the Madhyamakas, others say they're part of individual liberation, but time-wise the kind of in between the two. The Chittamatra is the mind-only school. Okay? And so the Madhyamakas don't think that this mind stream that the Chittamatrans were talking about, and if you recall, they talked about this mind stream as consisting of all of these little pieces, bits of time, if you will, strung together to create a mind stream. And that's not the ultimate emptiness, according to the Madhyamikas. They do agree that the mind stream does consist of moments of consciousness, however. It's just that that consciousness is not the ultimate. Okay? So that's where they're differentiating, that's where they're disagreeing with the Chittamatra point of view. So while the Chittamatrans found there was no self-nature in the objects of consciousness, the Madhyamaka Rangtongs are finding there is no self-nature in either the objects, so they're agreeing at that level, or the consciousness that recognizes that object. So when we talk about eye consciousness, ear consciousness, nose consciousness, so the object that it's seeing, so I'm seeing this little device, so the object itself is not it, but neither is the consciousness that I have of this being existent. Okay? So both of those are not ultimate. So Madhyamikas then all agreed that appearances are only relative truth and have no ultimate reality. So that's really kind of the key important idea here, is that there is no ultimate reality to all of these appearances. And the way they go about clarifying this is through a system of exhausting reasoning in the mind. Okay, so we go through these processes, and we looked at this before. They're really using something similar to what was used before, but just going on and on and on until you're finally convinced, okay, I believe this, I believe it with my heart, my soul, everything. Okay? So we're going to, for the practice, look at this Rangtong Sotangtrika approach. And so I want to go into a little bit more detail on this for you to kind of lay the groundwork for the actual meditation that we will use. So the Rangtong approach uses reason, as I mentioned, to establish that consciousness and the objects are not ultimately real, because they rise in dependence upon other things. So relative truth is how things ordinarily appear, particularly to a non-critical consciousness. They're there, you're not really thinking about what it really is. And absolute truth is the ultimate nature of things that is established through this reasoning process, this analysis of bit by bit. Now, as you recall, the previous ones we looked at a dream example as a way of a metaphor of thinking about this. So in the dream example, appearances happen. In our dream, we see these images of things, but they have no self-nature. They're not self-existent. And so all phenomena are then considered to be empty, have emptiness. So they're not accepting the Chittamatra view that some truly existent substance exists called mind. Okay? The Chittamatrans felt that mind actually, truly was real. Okay? So here they're saying, no, mind is not ordinary mind that we're talking about, the sense consciousness type mind, is not real either. So that's the denial that they're making there. Mind is relative, not absolute. So the ultimate nature of phenomena is emptiness because they're merely concepts. They're the labels. So even concepts such as emptiness itself is a relative concept. And so that can be established through the same process of analyzing it and so forth until we get to what we referred to previously as the emptiness of emptiness. So everything that exists only conventionally, and even the two truths themselves are relative. Okay? So even ultimate truth, from that point of view, becomes a form of relative truth. It's about the ultimate truth, but it in and of itself is actually relative truth. In fact, J. Tsongkhapa, who was the founder of the Gelugpas, wrote that everything we can think about, talk about, is relative truth. Because you can't talk about something from an ultimate point of view. Okay? You have to have labels, you have to have words, you have to have concepts in order to do that. And while that's helpful in pointing out what ultimate truth is and all about, it in and of itself is not ultimate truth. Okay? Now that becomes important later when we get into that division with the Prasangikas, and then another group that comes along after that, and the arguments between those. So ultimately, the true nature of things cannot be conceptualized in any way as being either existent or non-existent or both or neither. So we get back to the tetradilemma idea there. Okay? It's beyond all of those ideas of it as well. And so we go through this method to examine all the elements of existence in terms of these processes until we are absolutely convinced of this. Okay? So we're reinforcing, habituating over and over again until we're really convinced of this. So one approach to doing this is to break phenomena down into parts. We looked at that process previously. Is it a single entity or made up of parts? Is there one or many of them? And going through all of that kind of analysis. Another approach is dependent arising. Is it dependent in some way upon another thing? So if we took a piece of paper, for example, is that dependent upon something else? Or did it somehow just manifest as paper in and of itself? Well, we know that paper tends to come from pulp made from trees, and there's all kinds of different interconnections that, if we go through an analysis of the simple sheet of paper, get involved in where that came from and the various dependencies and so forth. So we can go through that kind of analysis about it as well, and again arrive at the idea that it has no self-nature. And so we exhaust that. And we can also do it with the senses. And that's the one that we're going to be using for the actual meditation. So we can look at it in terms of seeing and hearing and smelling, tasting, touching, and thinking. Okay? And from a Buddhist point of view, remember, it's the 5 senses that we normally think of, and thinking. This is the 6th sense. And so we have those 6 senses, and we can go through and we can analyze things in terms of how we perceive them from those 6 senses. So it's actually another form of Vipassana meditation. As we pointed out before, Vipassana tends to focus, it's usually translated as special insight, but that tends to focus on the wisdom nature of things. And so this is another one of those. So this time we're going to follow this Rangtong Sochantrika Madhyamaka approach and look at how these things tend to exist, or how we perceive them. And we go through this process. Eventually we dedicate the merit and so forth, as we have done before. So that is the essence of the wisdom approach in the look at this from the point of view of the path of the Bodhisattva.